Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I have a few prepared remarks. One thing that I wanted to say at the outset is, of course, we have all been, I'm sure, paying attention to the tragedy that has occurred in Haiti. And one of the things that interests me about Guantanamo is that particularly in the early years that we had the base, in the early 1900s, there was an earthquake in Jamaica. And President Theodore Roosevelt dispatched ships with doctors and nurses on board to Jamaica. The governor of Jamaica, who was a bit of an idiot, didn't like the U.S. interference, but nevertheless we provided very quick medical assistance and needed supplies. Guantanamo is serving that function even as we speak. One of the first ships to arrive in Haiti after the earthquake, I read in the New York Times this morning, was a military ship in a Coast Guard cutter that was based at Guantanamo. And I also understand that a number of people who have been rescued who were injured in the earthquake, including the Spanish ambassador to Haiti, have been taken to Guantanamo for medical attention. So this is something that I think if and when relations between the United States and Cuba become much more amicable or relations are restored, I would like to see if this to be considered as a way in which Guantanamo could be used, because earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, this is a very busy seismic area of the Caribbean, and of course repeated hurricanes. There are disasters that occur throughout that region almost every year. Okay, well, I call this talk sort of my voyage of discovery. And I'll tell you how this became a research topic of mine, because when I first decided to write about Guantanamo, it was 2003, and there was practically nothing written about the history of Guantanamo. And at that time, it had not achieved the infamous reputation that it has subsequently acquired as an interrogation and detention center for suspected international terrorists. Well, I had written a paper about the good neighbor policy that I wanted to get published, and it mentioned Guantanamo in passing. And one of the outside readers who hated my essay asked rhetorically, how would Mr. Schwab feel about it if Cuba had a major military base on U.S. soil? Well, the notion, of course, seemed preposterous. But my wife, Diana, said, well, there's your research topic. And my graduate advisor virtually said the same words after shooing me away from another proposed topic. I knew very little about Guantanamo at that time. It was the oldest U.S. overseas base, and the only one in a nation with which we had not had normal diplomatic relations for, at that time, over 40 years. Now, of course, about 50 years. Virtually nothing had been written about its history. And this led me to ask my own rhetorical questions. Why did we get it? Why had we kept it? Had it always been a sore point in U.S.-Cuban relations? Why had historians ignored it? I didn't know the answers to any of those questions. And I was literally amazed to find that at that time there were only 2 history dissertations that focused specifically on Guantanamo. One by a fellow named Bradley Reynolds, who hated the subject, that limited its scope to the period from 1895 to 1910. The reason he hated it was he had a hard time finding any information. And the second was by a woman named Mary McCoy that covers a much broader period, but it's essentially a Marxist interpretation that takes as gospel Fidel Castro's claim that our presence at Guantanamo is illegal, in spite of the fact that there are two separate bilateral treaties that provide for the leasing arrangement, and every president, from Theodore Roosevelt, certainly to George W. Bush, and I would say President Obama, has essentially affirmed our right to be there. I think the actions that I mentioned just a few minutes ago are a kind of tacit information that Guantanamo can be useful in times of serious distress. Well, shortly after I decided to consider this topic seriously, I read a brief historical essay, also by Bradley Reynolds, that lacked a unifying theme. It was published in a book called U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Bases Overseas, a rather dry book, but it did sketch Guantanamo's history from 1898 to the present. It at least told me that Guantanamo had served multiple functions over this 90-year period and had been an ongoing prominent factor in U.S.-Cuban relations. So on the basis of this rather skimpy essay, I decided that if nothing else, I could use Reynolds' article as a draft outline and a guide to the work that I would write. A major focus of my book is on the period 1934 to the present, for it was in 1934 that the United States government abrogated the Platt Amendment, but renewed the treaty concerning the lease for Guantanamo, and Franklin Roosevelt used exactly the same language that his cousin Theodore Roosevelt had dictated in 1903. Now, there are at least a couple of events affecting my research that occurred, I would say, serendipitously. Early on, a New York literary agent found out that I was doing this. I'm not sure how he discovered me, but he contacted me to offer his services and to request that I write a book proposal that he could flog with various publishing houses. This prompted me to organize my thoughts and to write what essentially became the introductory chapter to my work. Ultimately, this agent informed me that he had learned that another writer had signed a contract with a major New York publishing firm to write a history of Guantanamo, and he didn't think the commercial market would absorb two works on this subject. The other book has never materialized. The second serendipitous event was that one of the first places I went to do research was the Washington Navy Yard. And what I do whenever I plan to go to an archive is I get in touch with the head archivist before I'm coming, and I say, this is my topic and this is what I want to do. You know, is it worth coming there? And can you help me out? And that way I at least have some idea of the lay of the land before I go. Well, the archivist there, on the second day that I showed up, he had a little glint in his eye, and he sort of motioned for me to come over. And he said, Mr. Schwab, he said, I have an idea for you. And he said, but before I share my idea, he said, would you promise me that when you finish your dissertation, you will give me a copy of the dissertation for the library, and if it becomes a book, which I suspect it will, would you give us a copy of the book as well? And I said, sure, assuming you have a good idea for me, which I think you do. And he said, well, he said, do you have time and money to travel and do research? And I said, yes, I have some grants from the university. And he said, well, he said, I think if you would go to various presidential libraries, perhaps starting with Herbert Hoover's library up in Iowa and going at least through every presidential library through Lyndon Johnson, he said, I think you'd find a lot of stuff in presidential papers that has not been redacted by your former employer, the Central Intelligence Agency. So I said, hey, that's a great idea. And that's exactly what I did.